My son was afraid of his imaginary friend, the one who was always his refuge, someone to play with. In the new house, he suddenly feared him. He described him differently, and he was more present at all times, even when someone wanted to play with him. The only different thing I did, and my serious mistake, is that I started calling him by name. I talked to him with that imaginary friend so he could play with my son. And I think I opened a door that shouldn't have been opened. Today we're going to enter that strange and mysterious world of imaginary friends, everyone. And if you, who's listening to us, didn't have one, I'm sure you know someone who did, even if they didn't use that name. We all know someone who talked to something that doesn't exist at a very young age. So these beings are the common thread of this episode, although we won't limit ourselves, because we'll also talk about ghosts, spirits, and restless souls that have been seen by children. We hope you're ready to listen. And if there are children nearby, I think this is one of those episodes they shouldn't listen to, at least not alone, not without you to accompany them. So here's this warning. Here's this little warning. And if you want to leave, this is your last chance. Because in 10 seconds we begin with Relatos de la Noche. 7, 6,
5,
5, 4, 3. Hello everyone, I want to share something that happened when my son was very young. It's not going to be a long story, but at least for me, it was really scary. This happened at the end of 2016 when I had recently separated and moved with my son to the Colonia Doctores in Mexico City. He was 3 years old at the time, almost 4, and his name is Freddy. At that time, I needed a cheap place close to my job and also near the daycare where I left him every morning. I found an apartment that met those requirements. The only downside was the building was nearly empty. The man who rented it to me told me that several neighbors had left because the building had old damage, and some people claimed it wouldn't withstand a strong earthquake. At one time, living there was actually illegal. But I didn't have many options, so I accepted it. The apartment was simple, but it had 2 bedrooms. I was excited because my son was finally getting his own room. We were on the 8th floor, and the view was surprisingly beautiful. Freddy's room had a big window that faced the street. You could see much of the neighborhood from there. The first few days, everything seemed very pleasant. He played in the living room, watched cartoons, and kept me company while I cooked. But as soon as it was time to sleep, the problems started. He didn't want to go to his room. Initially, I assumed it was just typical kid behavior. He wanted to stay with me, be held, or have me lie down with him. But one night I asked him directly what was going on. He said he didn't want to sleep in his room because Rufo was there. I knew that name. Rufo was an imaginary friend he had had for a long time, from back when my mother-in-law used to take care of him. She told me that sometimes she saw him playing alone and saying he was with a little clown named. It never worried me too much, nor did it worry her. It seemed normal. I asked Freddy if Rufo was in the apartment, and he said yes. So I asked him where he was. He turned toward his room's door and said he was at the window. That didn't seem strange to me either. I thought it was just his imagination, or maybe he saw someone before falling asleep, like someone peeking in from the street or something. But I asked what it looked like. Freddy took a while to answer. Then he said that it was Rufo, but that now he looked different. When I asked him how different, He didn't want to explain it. As the days went by, he started avoiding that room, even during the day. If he went in to get a toy, he'd do it quickly and come right back to me. Sometimes I saw him peeking in from the door, looking at the window, as if he was watching out for something. One day I asked him to draw Rufo for me. He already drew a lot of things, little figures, cars, circles, which he said were people. He sat at the table and started drawing intently. When he finished, he showed me the paper. It was the figure of a man like little kids draw, a circle for the head and lines for the arms and legs. But the whole face was painted red. It wasn't just a spot, it was the whole face, without going outside the lines. I asked him why his face was that color, and Freddy just said that's how his face was. From then on, he didn't want to sleep alone in that room anymore. He wouldn't even stay there playing if I wasn't nearby. He always ended up sleeping with me. One night I tried to calm him down, or so I thought. I went alone into Freddy's room and left the door open so he could hear me from the living room. I spoke out loud as if I were scolding someone. I told him that I already knew he was there, that I didn't want him bothering my son, and that he should leave the apartment. I did it more as a way to reassure Freddy than because I actually thought there was an imaginary friend, of course. And nothing happened. But one Saturday morning I was cleaning the apartment. Freddy was watching cartoons in the living room, while I picked up toys and dusted his desk in his room. I opened the curtains to let the light in, and then I saw something on the window. At first I thought they were stains, and I got closer to clean them. That's when I realized they were handprints that weren't on the inside. They were on the outside of the glass. They were two open hands, as if someone had leaned there looking into the room. As you may remember, we lived on the 8th floor. There wasn't a balcony or anywhere outside for someone to stand. I stood there for a moment looking at the glass, not understanding how those marks could be there. In the end, I was able to clean them off with a cloth, and I didn't say anything to my son. The following year, the 2017 earthquakes hit. After the inspections by civil protection authorities, we were told that the building had structural damage and that it was going to be evacuated. We had to leave. Later, I learned the building was demolished. Freddy is older now, and he doesn't even remember having an imaginary friend named Rufo. But believe me when I tell you that I still remember perfectly, and those marks etched on his bedroom window. What I'm about to tell you happened when my daughter was 4 years old. At that time, we had already been living in San Diego, California for about 2 or 3 years, in a house we rented in an old and very quiet part of the city. It was a medium-sized one-story house, one of those built in the 50s, with a long hallway that connected the bedrooms to the living room. My daughter had always slept well. She had her own room since she was little. She never got used to sleeping with us, nor was she ever afraid. But specifically after a storm that left us without power for an entire day, strange things started happening in the middle of the night, as if something had awakened. Several times my wife or I would wake up because we heard her talking, speaking softly as if she were chatting with someone. We assumed she was sleep-talking or dreaming. When I heard her, I got up to see what she was doing. Her door was slightly open and I could hear her voice from the hallway. I approached quietly to avoid waking her. When I peeked into the room, she wasn't in bed. I found her sitting on the floor, right at the entrance to the room, looking down the hallway while speaking in a low voice. I asked her who she was talking to. She answered me very calmly, "With the lady who lives in the house." I thought she was half asleep, so I picked her up and took her back to her bed. The next day, she remembered nothing that happened. But it wasn't the only time. It started happening often. In the middle of the night, we heard her speak softly and sometimes laugh. When we asked her who she was talking to, she always answered the same thing, "With the lady." She said the lady would open the door for her at night from the hallway and talk to her to make her get up. She never mentioned any other name and didn't seem afraid. One afternoon while we were having dinner, she said something that made us think even more. She mentioned that the lady was sad because her room used to be hers. We didn't really understand what she meant, but my husband got curious and decided to look into the house a bit. Since it was a rental, it wasn't hard to find out who had lived there before us. It turned out that for many years, two elderly ladies had lived there. They were sisters. Both of them had passed away a few years ago. Neither of them died in the house, according to what we were told, but in a hospital after age-related illnesses. That made us a little uneasy, but it also had a simple explanation. We thought that maybe a neighbor had mentioned that story about our daughter when she used to go play with a girl who lived a few houses down from us, where children of that age always gathered. Kids hear more than you think. So we decided to let it go, not to make a mountain out of a molehill, because of course that had to be it. A few days went by without anything strange happening, until one night when I woke up again after hearing his voice. It was just like the other times, speaking softly. I got up and walked toward the hallway. The light was off, but some brightness was coming in from the living room. That's where I saw my daughter. She was sitting on the floor right outside her room, looking down the hallway while talking to someone. I couldn't make out what she was saying, just her voice. Her shadow was cast on the hallway wall by the light coming from the living room, but it wasn't the only shadow being reflected. There was another one. It was taller than hers, as if someone was standing in front of my daughter. I paused for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. And as soon as I took a step toward her, the second shadow disappeared. My daughter looked at me as if nothing had happened. I put her to bed and said nothing about what I'd seen. And even so, we kept thinking that everything had some explanation, that everything had to have one. Maybe it was the street light coming in through a window, or a shadow that moved when I walked. Months later, something happened that reminded me of that night. We had hired a babysitter to stay with our daughter a couple of afternoons a week, and when we went out at night, she was a high school student who lived nearby and seemed like a very responsible girl. One day, when we came home very late after a work meeting, she told us something very uneasily. She asked if our daughter often got up in the night. We told her yes, that sometimes she talked in her sleep. Then she told us that that night she heard her talking from the hallway, that she got up to see if she was okay and saw her sitting on the floor, right outside her room. She said it looked like she was talking to someone. When I asked her what she meant by that, she hesitated for a moment before answering. Then she told us that when she looked down the hallway, she managed to see something else, that next to my daughter, there was another silhouette, as if someone was standing in front of her. What the babysitter thought was that maybe one of us had arrived earlier and she hadn't noticed. But when she got closer, she realized there was no one else. And of course that night we weren't at home. The only people there, at least alive, were her and my daughter. My son started drawing from a very young age, like all children. At first, he would just draw little balls, sticks, circles that he said were people or animals, and over time he got better, which is completely normal. The curious thing is that he almost always ended up drawing the same thing, a house. It's not unusual for a child to draw houses, of course, many children do it. But what started to catch our attention was that it was always the same little house, with the same details, repeated over and over again with slight variations, but always the same, as if that's what was in his head. The door was always in the center. To the left of the door there was a window, and that window was always broken. The corner of the glass, as if a piece was missing. He used to draw flowers under the window, and on the right side of the house, he always drew a tree with a very particular shape. The trunk went straight up, and then two big branches opened up like a Y. A Y? At first, we weren't worried because we thought he had simply invented a house in his imagination and liked to draw it. It was his way to practice or entertain himself. But the years went by, he kept getting better and better, and the house kept appearing. When he was 5 years old, he was already drawing better. The lines were very clear and the details more precise. The broken window was still there, always on the same side. The flowers, too. The Y-shaped tree, exactly the same in every drawing. One day my wife asked him what that house was, and he said it was just a nice house. Another day I asked him if it was a friend's house or some relative's house we weren't thinking of, and he told me no, that it was a house where children lived, nothing else. He either didn't know or didn't want to tell us more. We thought it was just a child's imagination, something he had seen in a cartoon or in a coloring book. Over time, he stopped drawing as much like many kids do. He started school, then soccer, then other things that caught his attention more. The house appeared less and less in his drawings, until one day he stopped drawing altogether. Several years passed before the next part of this story. When my son was 10 years old, my wife and I finally started looking for a house to buy. We had rented for years and wanted our own place. Finally, loans became available. We viewed several properties, but something always held us back. And one day an agent told us about a house that was priced really well, a great opportunity. He told us that those opportunities were rare in that neighborhood, that normally houses there cost a lot more. It wouldn't last long on the market. I obviously asked him several times if there was any problem with the house. And the man just said it was an old house but solid, that it would last many years. So we agreed to go see it. 3 of us went Saturday morning. When we got to the street where the house was, even from the car my wife fell silent. And I noticed the same thing too, almost at the same time as her. And the house was exactly the same. Next to the drawings, the door was in the center. On the left, there was a window with the glass broken in one corner. Below that window, there was a small patch of soil where some neglected flowers were still growing. And on the right side of the lot, there was a tree that grew straight up and split into 2 branches, forming a perfect Y shape. We stood for a few seconds looking at the facade and didn't say anything. My son was also looking at the house from the back seat, but he didn't seem surprised or scared. He was just staring at it intently. My wife looked at me and we both knew it without saying a word. There was no way we could go into that house. When the agent came out to meet us on the sidewalk, I told him we had changed our minds. We'd rather not look inside. The man stared at us briefly, as if I had seen that reaction before. Then he sighed a little and said he understood. He told us he usually preferred to share the house's story after the agent had visited, but that in our case it didn't make sense to do it afterwards. That several years ago, a woman lived in that house with her 2 small children. One night, the woman killed her 2 children inside the house. Then she tried to take her own life, but failed. The case made local news and became a hot topic in the neighborhood. Since then, the house has changed owners several times, but no one stayed for very long. And in the end, it ended up staying empty for years. That's why they were selling it so cheap. We stayed there listening in silence. No one said anything for a few moments. In the end, we thanked him for the information and left. That night when we were at home, I remembered all the drawings my son made when he was little. The broken window, the flowers under the window, the Y-shaped tree. I looked in a box where we kept some of his things from when he was younger, and I still found several. It wasn't our imagination. They were practically identical to the house we had seen that morning. The strangest thing is that we had never been down that street before that day, not even that neighborhood. And my son stopped drawing that house many years before we even knew it existed. There was no reaction from him. It was just as if it were any ordinary house. And I thank God for that. What do you think of the episode so far, everyone? We thank you for making it this far, and if you're listening to us on YouTube, let me remind you that giving us a thumbs up is very, very, very important. It's the best way to help us keep this project going. And we always have about 300,000 views and only 10,000 likes. So, what's going on with all of you who aren't leaving us a sign that you're enjoying the content? If you listen to us on Spotify, leave us a 5-star rating on the podcast. And, wherever you listen to us, support us in whatever way the platform allows so we can reach more people. Don't go anywhere because there are still more stories to come. And there will be those who say we saved the best for last, but you all can judge that for yourselves. Let us know which story was your favorite today. Is the break over? We continue with more Relatos de la Noche. Good evening, and thank you for letting me be part of this community and for allowing me to share my story with you today. I'm going to tell you about a time when we lived in a rented house. An old but very beautiful house, one of those that still have wooden floors where you can hear everyone's footsteps, like in a horror movie. When we moved in, the owners told us that some things would stay because they had been in the house for many years. Among those things, there were a couple of paintings hanging in the hallway that connected the living room to the bedrooms, and they were literally fixed to the wall. Removing them risked damaging them forever. One of those pictures was an old black and white photograph. It was a photo of a boy about 7 or 8 years old, dressed in formal clothes like children used to wear in the past. He had a serious expression that always seemed a bit strange to me, but nothing more. It didn't scare me. It was simply another old photo in an old house. It was part of its personality, I guess. Later, we began noticing something unusual with my daughter. Sometimes when she walked down the hallway, she would stop in front of the photograph and just stare at it. At first, I thought it just caught her attention because kids usually notice things that adults don't even see, but then she started talking to it. Every now and then we would walk down the hallway and see her standing in front of the photo, speaking softly as if she were having a conversation with someone. One afternoon, I asked her who she was talking to. She calmly answered that she was talking to the boy. I thought it was just a game and left it at that, but as the days went by, she started doing it more and more often. Sometimes she'd say things while looking at the photo, and on one occasion, I even heard her laugh. When we asked her what she was doing, she always answered the same thing, that she was talking to the boy in the photograph. One day I decided to ask her what that boy's name was. My daughter answered immediately, as if she had always known. She said his name was Daniel. That did catch my attention because the boy's name wasn't written anywhere in the house. The photo didn't have any plaque or any inscription. I asked her how she knew his name, and she said he had told her himself. My wife thought that maybe our daughter had heard that name at some point and had associated it with the photograph. Children can do that very easily. A few days went by and we stopped paying attention to the matter. But one afternoon, while we were cleaning the hallway, I looked at the photograph more carefully. You could tell it was very old because of the type of paper and the worn-out frame, and I found myself wondering who the heck that boy was. A few days later, the homeowners visited to check on some garden issues we had mentioned. I took the opportunity to ask them about the photograph in the hallway. I showed him the picture. I asked them if they knew who that boy was, if they knew him. The man stared at the picture for a few seconds before answering. Then he said yes, that boy had lived in that same house many years ago, that he was the son of the family who had owned the property before them. He told me that the boy's name was Daniel, that he was now an adult, that he was the one who had sold them the house. They met before during the era, he said. When I heard that, I felt something very strange, but I tried not to show it. I thought that maybe my daughter had heard that name in some conversation, that she had simply repeated it, but that's not really a reasonable explanation. Over time, my daughter stopped talking to the boy in the photo, or at least we stopped noticing it. Life went on as usual, and the picture remained hanging in the hallway while we lived there. But I always had that doubt. What was my daughter talking to? How did she know the boy's name if he wasn't a ghost? If that boy had grown up to become an adult? My mom says there was something else taking advantage of that photograph. Something that might have been there since the real Daniel lived in the house. That for some reason, Daniel sold it as soon as he had the chance. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Uriel. If you do, thank you for telling my story. It happened in San Luis Potosi when we were living in a house that my partner's grandmother lent us. In fact, it was next to her house, and we took care of her in exchange for being able to live there. What I'm going to share with you happened very soon after we arrived there, during that stage of settling in and getting used to the lady's routine, learning the normal noises of an old house, discovering which doors creaked. My oldest son, who at that time was the only one, was always a very restless child. He would run everywhere, make up games with anything, and talk to himself while he played. That's why when he started talking to an imaginary friend, we weren't worried at all. A lot of kids do that, and it's completely normal. He said his name was Tomás. And as the week went by, little things started happening in the house that made us notice that name even more. The first one was very simple. One day we found several toys scattered in the kitchen. We thought my son had taken them there while playing and then forgot to pick them up, but when we asked him, he said he hadn't moved them. He said it was Tomás. We told him not to blame his imaginary friend and to pick up his things. But little by little, other very similar situations started to happen. A couple of times we found drawers open in the living room. On another occasion, a glass appeared broken on the kitchen floor. One day, my wife left the TV remote on the table and later we found it lying in the hallway. And every time we asked my son what had happened, he answered the same thing, that it had been Tomás. There came a point when we started to get really upset with him, that we scolded him. We thought he was just being mischievous and using that imaginary friend as an excuse. We even told him several times that it wasn't a good idea to blame someone who didn't exist. One afternoon I scolded him because we found several of my books lying on the study floor. And as always, he insisted that it wasn't him. He told me something that I remember well, with chills even today as I write it. He said that Tomás would get really angry when we said he didn't exist. At that moment, what I thought was that he was just making things up to avoid trouble. But there was one detail that did catch my attention. I once asked him what Tomás was like. My son thought for a moment and then said that Tomás didn't talk much, that he almost never said anything. He only moved things. Several months went by like that. For us, it was already clear that anything out of place in the house was our son's fault. If something fell, if something showed up somewhere else, or if a drawer was open, we assumed he had been playing there and we scolded him. Until summer came. That year, we decided that my son would spend 2 weeks with my parents in Aguascalientes, a little over 2 hours from San Luis. It was the first time he had stayed away from home for so long. So we took him there on a Saturday morning while he was very sad. And then we came back alone, missing him, but also looking forward to having those 2 weeks free. The house had become completely quiet. Or at least that's what we were thinking. 2 nights later, my wife left a glass on the kitchen table before we went to bed. And the next morning, when I came down for coffee, the glass was right in the hallway. I thought that maybe one of us had moved it without realizing during the night. But that wasn't the case. And the glass was standing upright, standing in the middle of the hallway. It didn't make sense that it had fallen and hadn't broken. Later that afternoon, something else happened. I was reading in the living room when I heard a bang in the study. I went to see what had happened and found several of my books lying on the floor, as if someone had pushed them off the desk. There was no one in the house. During those days, we kept finding things out of place. A drawer left open in the kitchen. A chair moved a few centimeters from where it was before. One of my son's toys even appeared in the hallway, even though he was far away and no one had entered his room. In short, the same things happened that used to happen when he was at home. The only difference was that week my son was hundreds of kilometers away with his grandparents. When we went to pick him up a few days later while we were driving back in the car, I asked him a question that had been on my mind for several days. I asked him if Tomás was still in the house. My son looked at me from the back seat and answered calmly but firmly. He said yes. He said that Tomás never left, that he was just waiting for someone to come back so he could play again. We had a mass said for him every week for years, but the manifestations never stopped.